Hi folks, this is Dan Jaffe Wilder. This is a pre-recorded webinar, so I won't be able to hear any of you, but I hope you can make good use of this. This is a topic that I've entitled Why We Care, How Our Choices on the Landscape Affect the World. Pretty much what this is a primer on ecological landscaping, why it's important, the sort of techniques we might use to employ, and kind of pitfalls we might want to try and avoid. If this actually is useful to you, you'll see a link to my website at the end of the lecture. I would love to hear back from you. With that in mind, let's jump into things. So, what are we all doing here? The basic idea is that what we do on the landscape affects much more than just our personal area. Our plant choices really do matter. This isn't something that needs to be all or nothing, but it's something that needs to be, well thought out. There are issues associated with non-native plants. I'm not going to say every non-native plant is bad. That would not be accurate. But when the entire landscape starts becoming non-native, we start seeing ecosystem functions start to break down. Lawns are kind of the epitome of poor landscaping practices. We'll get into the details of why lawns are so problematic. But there's a number of problems associated with lawns, and clearly there's a number of different lawns out there. Your backyard is probably not the same as the golf course, and there's kind of gradients of ecological, aptitude within this. And then the kind of grander question is, how far do we need to take this? Is this something that we need to be doing, 100%, 50%, 20%? Is it okay to have a lawn if the rest of our landscape is native? What about native cultivars? There's a lot of details involved in this. We're not going to get into all of them today, but we'll at least give you a good starting point for, how you can approach the landscape. So in the past, the messaging was, I think, dogmatic would probably be the best way to put it. It was very much all or nothing. It was very much doom and gloom. Not only do I think that's a poor way to kind of just, talk to people about these issues, but in many cases it's not all that necessary. So I was told, all lawns are bad and native plants are all bad, and, poison ivy is good because it's a native plant. And so what I really want to get into today is realistic goals and expectations. What can we actually do, and what will it do to the landscape? How are our decisions actually affecting things? When it comes down to it, there's a number of small, easy things that we can do that can really make a big difference. It's amazing what planting one native plant can do. So let's kind of put this into perspective. I want to approach this from the point of view of the plants. Here are two different species that are readily found. They're both geraniums. One of them is the garden geranium, the guy you see on the left there. You'll find that in just about any nursery that sells annual species. Walk over to your local Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, and you'll find this hanging out there. On the right side is wild geranium. Wild geranium is a native species. The garden geranium is not. And wild geranium is, amongst native plants, it's a pretty easy one to find. So if you've got any nursery that sells native plants, they probably have wild geranium. Let's look at what these plants do on the landscape. So both of them are good nectar sources for the European honeybee. The European honeybee is the honeybee. All of our honeybees are of European, well, actually they come from other places, but none of them are native. Most of them are European, in fact. And they are generalist feeders. They'll feed on just about anything, including European species, as well as a number of our native species and Chinese species and Australian species, and you get the idea. These are both good sources of nectar for a native species. This is Bombus impatiens. This is our native bumblebee. It's one of many bumblebees. It is probably the most common bumblebee on the landscape, at least in the Northeast. If you see a bumblebee pass you by and you point and say Bombus impatiens, you're probably going to be right about 75% of the time. The issue with the garden geranium is this is where things end. It's got really no more value around here. Whereas with the wild geranium, this is also a good source of nectar for the mining bees. These are one of our native specialized bees, and they're not ones to feed on just about anything. The garden geranium doesn't feed that one. It also doesn't feed the noble sun moth, the white-lined sphinx moth, the purple-lined sun moth, or the white marked tussock moth, all of which will feed on geranium in their caterpillar stages. In other words, they'll eat the leaves and then pupate and eventually become the butterfly or the moth in some cases here, which will feed on various other things. This is why native plants are important. On the left side, we've got two species fed. One of them is non-native. On the right side, we've got about 35. And this is one example of many. You will find plenty of other examples where the differences are night and day. Compare the feeding differences on, say, a ginkgo tree, which supports about 3 species, and an oak, which supports about 500. Sometimes these are really obvious connections. Everyone loves hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are fans of red tubular flowers. So what we're looking at here is Lobelia cardinalis. It's our native cardinal flower, a red flower with a long tube. Hummingbirds love it. This is Lonicera sempervirens. This is trumpet honeysuckle, a native vine, or technically a liana, which is just a woody vine. Again, red tubular flower. Red tubular flower, bee balm here, Monarda didyma. You see the pattern here. We've got a certain type of flower that is very attractive to a hummingbird. You'll also find butterflies on these and occasionally bees and some other stuff, but hummingbirds are really looking for this shape. Some connections are a little less direct, though. This is cinnamon fern, Osmundastrum cinnamonium. No red tubular flowers here, and yet this is still an important source of building material for hummingbirds. They will collect those white hairs and use them to line their nests. And hence you've got a hummingbird feeding on a native plant, or not really feeding, but benefiting from a native plant in a much more indirect sort of manner. And you'll find connections like these all throughout the landscape. So then it gets back to what can we really do? No more doom and gloom. Let's talk about what we can actually do that has effects on the landscape. Plant more natives. I'm not going to say plant nothing but natives. I don't think it's necessary. I grow tomatoes, nothing wrong with that, but plant more natives. What we're finding these days is we're looking for landscapes that are in the kind of 70% or more native sort of, range. If you have a vegetable garden and you've got a small patch of lawn and the rest of your landscape is native plants, you got nothing to be ashamed about. You're doing just fine. The problem becomes when your entire landscape is boxwood, burning bush, and lawn. Then you've got a dead landscape. So plant more natives. Kill your lawn. Lawns, as far as I'm concerned, are just a dumb idea. A whole lot of work, very little gain, and they are wasted space that could be better utilized. There are some value for certain lawns in certain places. I'm not going to say they all need to die, but a large proportion of them could use to. Avoid pesticides. This is pretty simple. We're trying to attract wildlife. We're trying to build habitat on the landscape. The last thing we want to be doing is using anything that kills life. And that's what "side" in pesticide means, is kills. So fungicide kills fungus. Insecticide kills insects. Avicide kills birds. Pesticides kill pests, which pretty much is what we label anything we don't like. Remove invasives. This is a tough sort of thing to do. Sometimes it's a single plant and it's easy. Other times it's what you're looking at in front of you. I think it makes a lot of sense to pick and choose your battles and tackle the ones that you can really have a good effect on. At the very least, don't plant invasives. And whenever possible, remove them from the landscape and replace them with native plants. That's an important key there. A lot of times it's just remove invasives and then it's like the job is done. If you're not replanting with native plants, those invasives are coming back. So don't forget step 2. Talk to people. We don't do this nearly enough. Tell your neighbor why you're not cutting your garden back in fall or why you're removing your lawn. Talk to the municipality about that, town green that is barely ever used and could use, say, a wildflower strip around the edge of it. Or maybe when they are removing the dead Norway maple, instead of planting another Norway maple, they instead plant the native red maple. Talk to your municipalities, get together with the local groups and see what you can do. And don't waste the good stuff. And what I mean by that is don't waste, don't throw out the leaf that falls on your lawn. Don't get rid of wood chips or woody material that could be made into wood chips. Don't let water escape your site. We've got a lot of good stuff on site. My general rule is don't let it leave the ground. And this is kind of a key message. There is great power in large numbers of people making small changes. I'm not saying you need to go out tomorrow and kill your entire lawn and remove every invasive species and plant 300 native species. I'm saying go out tomorrow and plant one new native plant. Maybe look towards reducing 10% of your lawn. Maybe look towards identifying the different invasive species found on your site, because identifying is clearly the first step in removing. It becomes powerful when large numbers of us start making these small changes, and that's when we can start really having a grand effect on the landscape. I'm not going to stop you from killing your entire lawn and planting 300 native species. In fact, I'll happily help you along the way. But we can take this piece by piece and step by step and start having really great effects in that manner. So what is the issue with lawn? So if anyone doesn't recognize it, what you're looking at is a picture of fertilizer runoff in the Mississippi River Delta. And lawns are a strange kind of concept. I mean, think about this. We've got a product on the landscape that takes up more land in America than corn and soy combined. We have a plant, lawn, that is unable to actually survive in the vast majority of America without us watering it and fertilizing it. It has all sorts of pest and disease problems, so we're constantly dumping a bunch of these kind of, pesticides and various other products on it to keep it alive. And God forbid the stuff actually starts to grow well, the first thing we do is break out all the mowers and cut it down to size. And in doing that, we stop it from being able to produce a good root system and ever become anything anywhere close to self-sustainable. We're stuck in a very odd cycle that we just can't seem to get rid of. We dump 90 million pounds of herbicides on lawns and gardens annually. And that's just herbicides. That's glyphosate in the form of Roundup. That's not fungicides and insecticides and everything else that we also dump on the lawns. 2 million pounds of fertilizer runs off into the Gulf of Mexico annually. The problem with this is that all that fertilizer runoff then causes major algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. And those algae blooms shut down oxygen cycling in the Gulf and everything dies. And we create the Gulf Dead Zone, which is absolutely massive and absolutely awful. Just in case you're not sure, dead zone is a bad thing. We waste 9 billion gallons of water every single day on lawns alone. To put that into perspective, if we could take that water and give it to every single person on the planet who's currently lacking clean drinking water, we could give them 7 gallons every single day. And instead, we're dumping this on lawns that frankly do nothing for us. And I talk to people about removing lawns and they say, well, my kids play on them, my dog plays on them. And then I start talking about the various different products we put on our lawns and why you probably don't want your kids and your dog playing on it, and you definitely don't want them tracking that back into the house where you live and eat and sleep. And if you talk to the lawn care company and say, I'm worried about pesticide exposure, I'd like you to reduce your pesticides, what they would do is they'll reduce it down to a single pesticide, the most commonly used one. It's called 2,4-D. It does every single one of these terrible things listed here. Lawns are a problem, not a solution. And I'd like to say we should just get rid of every single one of them. I don't think that's absolutely necessary, though. There are some uses for lawns. If you play soccer, you're probably playing soccer on a lawn, and that's actually a pretty good use of a lawn. I live in a little town that has a town green, and on the town green every week is the farmer's market. Also a pretty good use for a lawn. Where I work at Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, we use a turf lawn of sorts as trails in between the gardens. The problem I see with lawns is the fact that we have this mindset that every single house in New England needs to be fronted with this non-native monoculture of a mess of a plant that requires all of these inputs and doesn't give us anything in return. We can do better. We can do better. This is a lawn that I think works very, very well. This is wild strawberry. It's a native strawberry species. It's a perennial plant. You do not ever need to replant this. It stays low. You could mow it annually if you want to keep it even lower. We usually recommend mowing it at least, once a year, if not once every 3 years, just to keep the tree seedlings out so that it stays looking, lawn-like and doesn't turn back into a forest. This is a great species. It will grow in a range of habitats. It does not need good soil, so you don't need to amend your soil. It feeds us. As you can see on the right, it produces a very tasty little berry. What's also important is it feeds the wildlife. This is a plant that is a host site for about 87 different species of caterpillars, at least here in Massachusetts. That is a fantastically valuable plant. In fact, in terms of herbaceous plants, the only other genus that outcompetes it are the goldenrods, Solidago. Every other herbaceous plant that you've ever seen on one of those plant this for pollinator lists is less beneficial than this plant right here. And this is a plant that can function effectively as a lawn. It's a beast. It's almost a weed. And what that means is it's vigorous. And what that also means is that you can trample it. You can step on it. My chickens at home free range on this and they can't slow it down. My dog digs holes in it. It fills right back in. It's a good plant for that sort of abuse that a lawn needs to take. So then the next question becomes, what plants are the right plants to pick? What should I plant? And this depends a lot on what you're trying to accomplish. The nice thing about the native flora is that there are plants that can fit really anything you need. You want pretty plants? We've got pretty plants. This is bee balm, Monarda didyma. You want tasty plants? This is Solomon seal. People say you should eat the roots. I think the roots taste pretty awful, but the stems are quite tasty. You want plants that are good for pollinators? This mostly eaten plant here is Prunus serotina. This is black cherry, and that's a cecropia moth, one of our most funky, cool, amazing-looking caterpillars. You want plants for good erosion control? That's my dog Hooch, and that's a combination of Joe Pyeweed and roundleaf goldenrod that's right on a riverside, and the river bank is holding nice and firm because of all the roots of these plants. You want easy plants. We've got things like mayapple that spreads like wildfire. Good for areas where you just want something to fill in and cover. And these days, you see a lot about filter plants, rain gardens, green roofs, ways to kind of clean up water before it makes its way back into the streams and rivers and so forth. Lobelia syphilitica, once touted as a cure for syphilis. By the way, it does absolutely nothing for syphilis. Go to your doctor. Don't take lobelia. But that being said, this is a fantastic plant for rain gardens. And the cool thing about our native flora is that most of it will do numerous things. For example, this here is spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata. This is a beautiful plant. It is arguably tasty. There's better tasting plants, but this one does make a pretty decent tea. This is a fantastic pollinator plant. It seeds around in open soil, so it's good for erosion control. It's quite easy to grow, and I don't think this one's great for filter plants, but it is not a half-bad rain garden plant. And there's lots of different examples of plants that really can fit these multiple sort of spectrums. We can do a lot with these plants. So the question is, what do we put in what area? Right plant, right place is kind of my key for any of this. Decide what your conditions can support before you decide what plant to put there. Scarlet bee balm is a very, very popular plant, Monarda didyma. It likes sunny, moist conditions. It's not really a plant for sunny, dry sites, and yet it's planted there all the time, and it looks like this. This is the same plant. This is Monarda didyma growing in a sunny, dry site, stressed out and suffering from a disease known as powdery mildew, a very common disease on scarlet bee balm when it's stressed out, mostly when it's too dry. Let's flip that around a little bit and put up spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata. This one will not do well in conditions where Monarda didyma does well. This one does very well in sunny, dry, well-drained conditions. It does well in those kind of glacial sites that we have all across New England with very well-drained sandy soils. So if you've got the dry site, go for the plant on the right. If you've got the moist site, go for the plant on the left. Our native flora is immense. We have a lot of different choices, a lot of different plants that we can work with. This plant is pincushion plant, Diapensia lapponica. This is an awful choice for gardens, but this one makes a good point. This plant growing on the top of Mount Washington. This plant grows in conditions where the soil is about 1/8 of an inch of just grit. It handles winds of up to 234 miles per hour. It handles temperature fluctuations that'll range from 70 degrees down to 30 degrees, at night. This is an amazing difference of temperature in a single day. This plant can grow where we would think nothing could grow, and yet it thrives up there. And this is one of many plants that do. And yet I see things like this all the time. On the right side, you've got an effective growing plant. Looks like a coreopsis, not exactly sure. And on the left side, you've got an attempt at lawn, which is really a poor choice for these conditions. Lawns need a lot of care, so why we keep trying to stick them right on roadsides makes absolutely no sense to me. And yet oftentimes, as this lawn fails, the solution will be to come in and reseed with more lawn. We never think of putting something else in there. Let's put some coreopsis in there, or maybe let's find something lower growing because we don't want something as tall right on the roadside. We can put in Antenaria, we could put in Chrysogonum, we could put in Phlox. We have lots of choices. Let's stop looking at a failure as a chance to replant the same damn plant that failed on us. I'm asked to come to people's properties all the time and consult on landscapes, and I'll see stuff like this. And people will, bring me in and say, I don't know what to do here. Nothing will grow here. I'm trying and it just doesn't work. What do I need to do? What do I need to put in the soil? Do I need to add an irrigation system, compost? Please tell me what to do. And I'll start asking questions. I'll say, okay, what have you put in here before? What didn't work? Well, we put in hostas. They all died. Okay, when the hostas died, what do you try next? Well, we put in more hostas. Surprisingly, they died. we're stuck kind of on this list of maybe 15 plants that we know well. Hostas, astilbes, burning bush, barberry, lawn. We never think to put in, an Actaea or an Aruncus. Or a Lespedisia. It's all these different plants that most people have never heard of because they're not obsessed botanists like me. So the idea is to find out what plants will work in your conditions. Our native flora is immense. As I said, we have plants that will grow absolutely anywhere. And you don't need to get too bogged down on exactly what you mean by native. Take a nice general kind of input on what that means. Plants that build habitat. That's native enough for me. We have plants that'll grow just about anywhere. This is one of many lists that are available on my website, and you can always shoot me an email and say what will grow on my site. We've got plants that grow in the sun, the shade, the dry areas, the wet areas. I've got plants for compacted soils. I've got plants for polluted soils. I've got plants for cities. I've got plants for the rural landscapes. We have plants that will grow absolutely anywhere. It's just a matter of finding out which ones work for you. And there's a good chance when you start looking, you're going to find that it's not 2 or 3 species, but 20 or 30 species. And from there, you can decide what you want to see on your landscape. So what about invasive species? And before anyone jumps up, not all non-native plants are invasive. This is a common misconception and something that is spouted by some of the more dogmatic native approaches out there. It's simply not true. We have lots of non-native, non-invasive plants on the landscape. Think about your tomatoes and your rosemary and the apple trees. They're all non-native, they're all non-invasive. That being said, invasive is something specific. Invasive species are non-native species which cause ecological harm in their novel or new environment. And what that means is, you plant an apple tree and it's not causing any harm. You plant a burning bush and it spreads into the woodlands and takes over the landscape and does cause harm. And the problem with these species is that they've evolved in regions where they did not have any of, or let me put that differently. They evolved in a different region, and the checks and balances that kept them in balance in that region did not come over to America. They don't exist here. So, for example, burning bush has a number of different insects and beetles and feeders on, it in its native European continent that do not exist here in New England. So without those, you get these plants at a competitive advantage. And this competitive advantage means that they can outcompete the native flora. And when you don't have a native flora anymore, you don't have food for the wildlife. And you'll find that a few of these species in the landscape can take over a whole environment, and then all the wildlife just has to leave. There's no more food for them. And you just get this forest of burning bush and nothing else. And the problem with this sort of picture here is you think, oh, well, you still at least got the native trees. But as those trees age and get older and start to fall, there's no young seedlings coming to take their place, because as they drop seeds, the seedlings can't compete with that burning bush understory, and eventually even the trees disappear as well. And what doesn't make sense to me is that we have great replacements for every single invasive species out there. People love burning bush because it's bright red in the fall. Here are 3 of about 30 species I was able to think of that are vibrant red in the fall, in some cases nicer looking than the burning bush. On the left, we've got shadbush, which blooms in the spring, produces a very tasty berry in the midsummer, and then turns vibrant colors in fall. In the middle, we've got a combination of a couple different species of lowbush blueberries and huckleberries, also blooming in spring, also producing edible berries in the summertime, and also looking great in fall. On the right side is Aronia arbutifolia. It's the red chokeberry, sometimes called a red aronia berry. It's edible, without a doubt. It's not very tasty, very, very, very high in antioxidants. It's kind of becoming the new superfood, but also blooms in spring, produces these great berries, and then great color in fall. All of these do what burning bush does with the addition of edible berries and spring flowers, and they all feed wildlife. This is great. We can easily rename any of these burning bush. Talk to people. As I said, we don't do this nearly enough. Let's talk to the DOT, let's talk to the municipalities, let's talk about our roadsides. Let's plant the sort of plants on roadsides that you wouldn't think to plant in, say, your small garden. This is common milkweed. This is a vigorous spreading species. It's a fantastic plant for areas where you need the vigor of a spreading species. Something like a roadside, where you're going to get pollution, you're going to get compaction, you're going to get the car running it over when it needs to pull over. It's exactly where we want a plant like this. It'll spread well in those conditions. If it gets killed by the car running it over, it'll resprout and come back to life, and it's great habitat. We've got other options. Goldenrods are great options. Asters are great options. When we talk about the drainage ditches, let's fill them with cattails, a fantastic wildlife plant that's also a very good filter plant. Let's make sure the water leaving the drainage ditch is cleaner than the water that entered. Let's talk about parking lot islands. Staghorn sumac is a plant that many people love to hate. I absolutely love Staghorn sumac. Vibrant, beautiful fall color, great pollinator plant, makes a tasty tea and an even better cocktail, but it's a spreader, not a plant for a small space. Don't put it in your garden, but it's not about to spread out of the parking lot island and through the asphalt. That's exactly where we need a plant like this. How many people have seen a parking lot island that's nothing but red mulch because they tried planting something there, it died, they planted something else, it died, and they just kept planting plants that died until they finally gave up. Let's put in something that'll survive those conditions. Let's talk about our town centers. This is the High Line. This is New York City. If New York can do it, any rural New England community can do it. Let's tackle our abandoned lots. Look at what the Gangster Gardener is doing out in California. It's amazing work. Let's talk to our town municipalities. If you got a big green in the town and it's used for the farmer's market, that's fantastic. There's actually a good use of a lawn. Let's talk about doing a wildflower strip around the edge of it. Let's talk about planting some wildflowers under the trees. Let's talk about replacing the trees with native species. There's all these small little spaces where we can do any of this. Don't waste the good stuff. Leaves are fantastic. As they decompose, they feed the landscape, they feed the soil, and with good soil comes good plants. The only reason I like people bagging leaves and putting them on the roadside is because I can drive around with my truck and take them. But frankly, none of you should be doing this anymore. These leaves are important on the landscape. They make really good soil. Don't let your rainwater go. Collect it as much as you can. Use it to feed the landscape. Most plants are perfectly fine with water being fed right out of our, taps, but there's quite a few that really do a lot better with rainwater instead of tap water. Our ericaceous plants are like this, the blueberries, the rhododendrons, things like that. Water smartly. Everything this guy is doing is wrong. Everything is wrong. I can go on to it for an hour. He's watering at the wrong time of day. He's watering the leaves. Plants don't absorb water through their leaves, at least only extremely minimally. You need to get it into the roots. The lawn he's standing on is wrong. The plant choices are wrong. Everything is wrong. Let's water smartly. Learn how to treat things well. Frankly, once you've got an established garden, you should need to do very, very, very little watering. Plant plants that are adapted to your environment, and the watering needs are establishment. Help them get started, and then they're on their own, and they're just fine with that. Work with your land. It's amazing what digging a ditch can do. If you've got a spot where water is flowing very, very quickly, dig some ditches, dig some holes, let the water accumulate in those conditions and percolate more slowly. You'll find plants starting to grow right around those ditches and holes much more quickly than the other areas. And then as those roots permeate the soil, they will further slow down the water, capture that water, keep it on site. Save all the debris on your landscape. Nothing leaves the site. Compost everything you can. If wood comes down, that's great in the compost. If it's big stuff, use it to chip it and use it to line garden paths or make hugelkultur beds. Be lazy in the cold season. There's all these reasons not to do our sort of typical garden cleanup. Not saying you can't do anything, but don't cut back your perennials until the spring. We have a variety of native bees that will nest in those standing, dried, herbaceous stems. Those stems are often topped with seed heads. Those seed heads are good bird seed. That's free bird seed. Don't need to go to the store to buy bird seed if you just leave your garden up. All those stems are also good bird habitat. They need a nice safe place to kind of flit around and steer clear of things like the hawks above that are looking out for them. We've got a number of butterflies and moths that will overwinter in the leaf litter, usually as caterpillars or as chrysalis. You'll also find salamanders in there. Leave this stuff in place. So with that in mind, I gave you a whole bunch of ideas that really come with a whole bunch more. There's a lot more to kind of get into in every one of these typical kind of pieces. This is a starting point. I want everyone to kind of take these ideas and expand upon them. Please feel free to ask any questions. I know no one's listening to me right now, but when you hear this in another couple of days, and hopefully after that, feel free to reach out to me on my website. There's also some great plant lists on there. If you need some kind of lists of what you might start thinking to put on your landscape, make good use of it. Thank you so much, and you all have a great day.